l'intervista con Taras Kuzio sarà in inglese. All right, I think Dario, that organized this, is here with us. Well, hold on. I'm moving the people. All right, we'll put Taras in the middle. Hello, Dario. Can you hear us?
Oh, hi. Yeah, can you? My question will take the topic of Russian sentiment in Ukraine from the 1990s onward. I would like to ask you how this sentiment of Russia was developed and in what context it evolved in time, and also what kind of of justification they are giving, and if it is strong enough, the justification that they are giving to reduce the influence of this pro-Russian movement that they were still operating in Ukraine before the so-called ban that Zelensky made, obviously, at the beginning of the war.
Your question is a very big question because you are talking about 30 years of history. For me to respond, the most important thing is that to understand is that there are two ways of how Russia or Russian nationalism looked at Ukraine. And in the Soviet Union, from the 1920s onwards, Lenin created a union of 15 republics where Ukraine was one of the sovereign republics, sovereign within the Soviet Union, and Ukrainians were recognized as a separate people. Ukrainian language was recognized as a separate language. In 1945, Joseph Stalin negotiated three seats at the United Nations, one for the USSR, one for Ukraine, one for Belarus. So Ukraine was a founding member of the United Nations. This was in gratitude for World War II, of course. So this recognition of Ukrainians as a separate people also was promoted by the Soviet Union as, yes, you are separate, but you are always going to be close to us Russians. So separate but close was the Soviet position. Now, this position remained until Vladimir Putin. So it remained in the 1980s under Gorbachev, it remained in the 1990s under Yeltsin, and then things began to change under Putin. Putin's been in power now for 22 years, and he has undergone an evolution of Russian nationalism. I would call it stagnation. Because what has happened is that he, from about the mid-2000s, so after the Orange Revolution of 2004, Russian nationalism began to integrate Tsarist, pre-Soviet views of Ukrainians. In fact, Putin is anti-Lenin. He does not like Lenin. He thinks Lenin made a big mistake in creating union republics. He preferred Stalin's position, which was that the Soviet Union should be just one big Russia with Ukrainians, Tajiks, Georgians having autonomy, not a republic. So Putin wants to go back to the pre-Soviet position. And the Tsarist pre-Soviet position, which was also kept alive by white Russian emigres, is that there are no Ukrainians. So we have gone from the Soviet position of Ukrainians exist, but they are close to Russians, to the pre-Soviet position, there is no Ukraine and no Ukrainians. And this is a product of many things. It's a product of growing influence of Tsarist and white emigre nationalism in Putin's regime. Also, the growing strength of nationalism after the Orange Revolution, particularly after the invasion of Georgia in 2008.
Taras, if you don't mind, can you explain? Many people may not relate immediately to what white Russia mean.
Yeah, sure. White, I mean, during the Russian Civil War of 1917 to 1921, you had basically two major groups in the fighting in Russia. The Reds, who were obviously the Bolsheviks, and the Whites were those who supported either the Tsarist Empire, so the monarchy, or they supported the very brief democratic government that was in power in 2017. So when the Bolsheviks won in 1920-21 and created the Soviet Union, all of these opponents of the Bolsheviks went abroad. In fact, probably the majority went to France. If outside Paris, there's a huge cemetery of white Russian emigres. Then Paris was a destination. Now it's Londongrad since the 1990s. So I don't know why Paris is no longer popular, but it's now Londongrad, or as we joke, Moscow on the Thames. These were always called white Russian emigres because they were anti-Bolshevik, anti-Soviet Union, believers in the Tsar or some other far-right moves. In the 1920s and 30s, when it was very fashionable in Europe, of course, many of them became fascists. Many of these white Russian emigre writers who were buried abroad and white Russian generals who were buried abroad were brought back to Russia by Putin. He took their coffins, their remains, and reburied them in Russia. This began in 2004, 2005. So that, of course, had a big influence because you had the return of this white Russian or Tsarist emigre views, which were, heavily Russian nationalist, very anti-Soviet. And another big factor was in 2007, 2008, the two branches of the Russian Orthodox Church united. So you had the one branch inside Russia and the emigre Russian Orthodox Church, which was white Russian. Of course, it was anti-communist. This also increased the strength of this kind of, anti-Soviet, pre-Soviet Russian nationalism inside Russia, because of course the Russian Orthodox Church is extremely nationalistic, very xenophobically anti-Western, and also believes that there is no Ukraine, there is no Ukrainian people. The evolution of and the growing influence of these of these groups, of these influences, grew especially between the Orange Revolution of 2004, the Georgian invasion of 2008, and then when Putin came back as president in 2012. In 2012, when Putin came back, he came back extremely nationalistic. For example, there were massive protests against Putin in Moscow then, organized by Alexei Navalny and others. They were protesting about election fraud. And Putin, of course, because of his background, his KGB background, he always believes that these protests are organized by the CIA. They are never authentic protests. And so he hated Hillary Clinton then, because she was then U.S. Secretary of State, and she supported the protests. This has importance for 2016, the U.S. elections, because one reason Putin supported Trump was because he hated Hillary Clinton. For Putin, politics and all of these things are personal, and he takes everything personally. When he came back in 2012, you saw, for example, in Italy and elsewhere, the growing support from Moscow for the far right in Europe. It's really then the nationalism in Moscow, it stays within Russia and its neighbors, but also gets spread to Europe. There's financial support for the far right, like Le Pen, for the Northern League in Italy and elsewhere, in Hungary and other countries. So by then, what you have, and this is, I think, the way to look at it importantly, you have two kind of areas of nationalism which are integrated. Now, this is complicated, I know. One is the Soviet, and the Soviet kind of nationalism is to do with the Great Patriotic War. This was a cult, a religious cult, in the Soviet Union, and Putin revived the commemoration of the Great Patriotic War as a new religious cult. It was more important than, of course, 7th of November, Bolshevik Revolution. So the 9th of May, this was the day when we won, the USSR won, and the USSR became a nuclear superpower with a big empire. So this is something that Russians can be proud of. So, but linked to this was always that we defeated Nazism and we will defeat Nazism today. Which is, of course, completely hypocritical because Moscow is funding Nazism in Western Europe and nationalism and the far right. But, he's always hypocritical. The second part, so you have this Soviet Great Patriotic War, religious cult, defeat of Nazism, and then the other part is this Tsarist white Russian emigre nationalism, which denies the existence of Ukrainians and Belarusians, because their view, the pre-Soviet view, was that there are the three Eastern Slavic people, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, are branches of one pan-Russian nation. This is in Russian, Общерусский народ. So this is one people. Putin repeatedly says Ukrainians and Russians are one people. And anybody who opposes this, who disagrees with this, is a Nazi. It's very simple, because he equates, Ukrainian nationalism with Nazism. And if you don't agree that Ukrainians are little Russians or a branch of the pan-Russian nation, then you are a Nazi, you are a nationalist. So from 2012, this begins to really become stronger and stronger. Putin begins to see himself going into Russian history as the person that rebuilt this Russian world, in Russian, Ruski mir, the Russian world. And you have to understand this as not rebuilding the Soviet Union. That's impossible. But you are rebuilding the central part of the Soviet Union, because the central part of the Soviet Union was the three Eastern Slavic people. They were 2/3 of the population, and they controlled the politics, the military, the KGB. These were Eastern Slavs. So the other people were not important in that sense. So he's rebuilding the Russian world, and the Russian world is at the center of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is Putin's answer to the European Union. The problem he has is that Ukraine is not there. He has Russia, he has Lukashenko, Belarus, but Ukraine is missing, and you cannot have this Ruski mir of this Russian world without Ukraine. And so in 2014, he tries. He occupies Crimea. He tries to break away the south and east of Ukraine, but it does not work. It only begins to work a little bit in the Donbass, but not throughout the region. This region of south and east Ukraine, which is mainly Russian-speaking, it is 8 regions. So he succeeds in 2 of them, not in 8 of them. And then we get to 2022. So 8 years of an attempt by Putin to continue to pressure Ukraine to come and join the Russian Union by using the peace process to get Ukraine to accept Russian demands on, for example, how Ukraine would look like a federal state with neutrality, but part of the Russian sphere of influence. This failed. This 8 years of using the peace process and a kind of low-level military pressure failed, obviously. Neither President Poroshenko or President Zelensky accepted this pressure. So the new crisis begins in November of last year, and it's a completely artificial crisis. NATO is not going to invite Ukraine to join. America is not going to put missiles, was not planning to put missiles in Ukraine. And NATO-Ukrainian military cooperation has been happening since the 1990s. So there was no reason for this new crisis except Putin got fed up of Zelensky. And what Putin was angry about in particular was that Russian influence, Russian soft power in Ukraine was becoming zero. But he has caused this. This is what, nobody is going to tell a dictator that he's making those mistakes. Everybody around Putin is going to tell him how he's so great. Not that he's making mistakes. The reason why Russian soft power has collapsed in Ukraine since 2014 is obviously because of Russian military aggression, because of Crimea. Most Ukrainian Russian speakers supported Ukraine in 2014, like they are supporting Ukraine today. If you watch videos of Ukrainian soldiers, many of them are speaking Russian. It makes no difference whether they are patriotic or not. It has no influence. So the reason why Putin invaded is extremely difficult and complicated for Western, I think, people to understand, because we are living in postmodern 21st century Europe. Putin is living in the 19th century. And the reason why he's invading is he's invading on the basis of 19th century nationalistic historical myths, which do not, which have no basis in reality. So, because he believed, and maybe he still believes, that the majority of Ukrainians are pro-Russian and they are going to welcome his troops as liberators with flowers, he believed that he would capture Kyiv within 4 hours or 2 days. There were two plans. Completely misjudged the country. And I do not know any experts in Moscow, from think tanks, from academia, from politics, who understand Ukraine. Because you cannot understand a country if you have so many stereotypes, so many myths about a country. So they came to Ukraine. They believed, everybody would go, hurrah, hurrah, Russian liberators. Well, no, they greeted Russian troops with Stingers, javelins, and Turkish drones, leading to a complete massacre of Russian soldiers. The death number of Russian soldiers is bigger than Afghanistan in the Soviet, and what the Soviet Union was there in the 1980s. And it's more troops killed than America in Iraq and Afghanistan in only 5 weeks. Seven Russian generals have been killed in 5 weeks. This is simply incredible, and never mind military equipment. So they completely misjudged this because the invasion was based on these outdated historical myths that have no bearing in reality. You are invading a country.
Let me stop this man. He's very entertaining and very right on the spot, and I love to listen to you, but I also need to make sure that our listeners listen to us.
I was giving a massive question.
I gave you a massive question, but you and I do the same job. We know when to interrupt the speaker.
No, sure.
Let me interrupt you just there, for example. I know Bruno wants to ask a question, and welcome, Bruno. But let me interrupt you there and then let you. Many people in the chat are saying, okay, and I tend to agree with you. Let's be clear that the motivation behind the whole Putin's thing is essentially a view of the world and a sense of power and the role of what Russia is blah, blah, blah. So let's call it an ideology. Okay, right or wrong, justified or not, dated or not, and the background of it, your sketch, and my little knowledge I tend to convene. The question is, Italians like to see always an economic greedy motivation behind that. So there are a lot of talks about the underground of Ukraine, full of this and that, gold and riches and oil and precious metals. People, you understand, the fact that some of these metals and materials are called rare has got people all convinced that rare has nothing to do with the periodic position. They think they're very rare on Earth. They're the opposite of rare. We know they're very abundant, but apparently Ukraine has that. So bottom line, many people says, oh, there is an economic reason, a deep economic greedy reason under it. Russia wants to control Ukraine because of economic reason, and the Americans want to control Ukraine and plotted all this because of economic reason. What's your reaction?
Well, I would caution the people providing questions not to repeat Kremlin propaganda that Ukraine is somehow some kind of US puppet state. This is a viewpoint that you find on the extreme left throughout Western Europe, including like Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, former leader of the Labour Party. The reasons, of course, are many. One of the major reasons is that Russians do not know where their borders are. What is Russia? If you asked 5 Russians, 10 Russians, they would give you different answers. 14, all the other republics of the former Soviet Union, for them, their borders were what they inherited from the Soviet Union. For Russia, the borders are not the republic. They can be the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, the Russian world, Eurasia. So they don't really have a clear idea of what their borders are. And that's important because that means that they can say, well, Ukraine's Russian, as opposed to saying it's a foreign country. They don't treat it as a foreign country. The reason for this is because in the Soviet Union, Russia and the USSR were the same. That's how the Soviet Union was created. In Moscow, there were no institutions for the Russian Communist Republic. There was no Russian Communist Party, no Russian Communist Youth League, no Russian Academy of Sciences, unlike in, say, Ukraine or Georgia or elsewhere. So Russia and the USSR were the same. And so that means that Russia never declared independence from the Soviet Union. So that's one thing. The second thing is Russians always, even under Yeltsin, always believed that Eurasia was their right to have a sphere of influence. So they kind of looked like they agreed with the kind of the American position in the Cold War, looking at Latin America, that Eurasia is an area that they have a right to be a dominant sphere of influence. And these other countries are not really proper countries, and they should agree to be part of Russia's sphere of influence. That has consequences. It means that Russia is opposed to these countries in Eurasia joining the EU, joining NATO, and inviting UN peacekeepers. These are not allowed. Russia should do all of those things. But of course, the only way I would see this as economic is that for Putin's mindset, because Ukraine was such an important part of the Soviet economy, he believes that the way to help Russia revive itself as a great power, which is, that's his higher ideology. Russia should be a great power and respected by the United States. That would be easier if Ukraine was part of this Russian world, because in the Soviet Union, Ukraine had a very big military industrial complex. It was something like 40% of the economy. And the Ukraine had, for example, the biggest factory in the world producing nuclear weapons. It had about 50,000 people working there. So Putin has said many times that, if you combine the Ukrainian economy and Russian economy, this would be a powerhouse. This would be help Russia to revive itself at the center of this new Eurasian civilization, and then we can, take on the West. Then we can show the West who's the real power here, because Russia sees itself, this Eurasian civilization, as independent of both China to the east and the West, as well. And Ukraine is important from that. Food, I guess, food as well, because Ukraine has always been a major food producer, and every invader of Ukraine, from Tsars, from Nazis, from Stalin, has always believed that that's an important economic resource. Ukraine is, I think, the third biggest wheat exporter in the world, the first biggest exporter of sunflower oil in the world. So those are probably factors as well. And Ukrainian ports are important on the Black Sea coast. So those could be socioeconomic positions, but they are part of these other demands, sphere of influence and definition of what is Russia. How do you define Russia? And that certainly includes Ukraine.
So I wanted to ask you a question about the Russian end goal, in the sense that you already argued that Russia's main objective was to conquer or like absorb in some sort Ukraine into itself, right? Because Ukraine is a fake country, whatever. But then in the battlefield, I guess that they are kind of realizing that this is not possible, or at least it will take a very long time and it's very costly. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that they will reassess their goals? They will try for something different? Maybe they want to just split Ukraine in two, or just limit themselves to the Donbass. I also wanted to add like a corollary question. Do you think that in this all of Ukraine, also Western Ukraine is included? Because I've heard a lot of arguments about the fact that, for example, Lviv is not really Ukraine, is Poland, so then Poland should get it or whatever. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Just the last part of your question. Russian nationalists never saw West Ukraine as part of this Russian world. And the reason for that was that West Ukraine was never part of the Russian Empire. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so Russian nationalists see Ukraine as three parts: Crimea, so-called New Russia, which is east and south, and then Little Russia, which is Kyiv and central Ukraine. West Ukraine is not something they want to include. They see it as too influenced by Europe, by Polish influence, and too nationalistic. But yes, I mean, as of yesterday, all of Kyiv region was liberated from Russian troops, and so I think Plan A, which was to quickly take the capital city of Kyiv and either capture Zelensky or make him run away, is now no longer possible. If they had tried, it would have led to very many Russian deaths, because militarily fighting inside a big city is very costly in terms of humans' lives. Every building in Kyiv has probably stingers and javelins ready for Russian soldiers. And it's a city of 4 million, so it's a big city. And also, Putin underestimated Zelensky. He never treated him seriously. Oh, he's just a comedian. He's just he's more of a politician than your comedian who led 5 Star movement. And he did not run away, he stayed. So yes, possibly now we have Plan B. And Plan B, I don't think is just the Donbass. I think it's some kind of this, what Putin calls a land bridge, from the Russian border from Donbass Russian border going down to Crimea, sort of along the south and east. So kind of like New Russia, which is why maybe the reason why Mariupol was destroyed. It was 90% destroyed by Putin, because this is the key area. It's near the Russian border, and then from Mariupol you go westwards to Crimea. Possibly that could be the new strategy. You hear many rumors that Putin needs to show some kind of victory by the 9th of May. Because again, the 9th of May is this annual religious cult of celebration of the Great Patriotic War. And he has to show something that he's been victorious. So I think the strategy of having too many fronts, too many military fronts, has failed. So he's going to maybe concentrate on one or two areas. But he's he's lost a lot of troops and a lot of equipment. So of course he doesn't care. He doesn't care about the human lives, the lives of conscripts. He doesn't care that they have died in large numbers. But nevertheless, this information is getting back to Russia, and this will increase opposition to Putin amongst people whose sons will not come home. So it is dangerous for him like this. One of the reasons the Soviet Union, the opposition movement in the Soviet Union in the 1980s grew was because of opposition to Afghanistan, opposition to Soviet troops dying in Afghanistan. So this is kind of similar to this. And, he's already lost something like 18,000 Russian troops. Plus, you always have to calculate for every one soldier killed, you have 3 wounded. So that's something like 40,000 wounded and killed. That's a lot of dead. And you can see this by just going on YouTube. I mean, just look at so many videos of destroyed Russian convoys and dead Russian soldiers, and they do not collect these bodies. They are really disgusting in terms of they don't care about the dead Russian soldiers. It's the Ukrainians who are collecting the bodies. So yes, I think Plan B is now the next strategy. Does he have an end game? It's pretty impossible for me to understand, because if your end game, the original end game, was Ukraine to become a second Belarus. Little Russia would be next to White Russia, Belarus and Ukraine. And they would be happy little places inside the Russian world with, pro-Russian dictators like Lukashenko. This was the plan, to remake Ukraine into some kind of country like Belarus, with a puppet dictator like Lukashenko. That has failed, and it's impossible in Ukraine. It's impossible because identity was already strong in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine, and you've had 30 years of nation building, 30 years of the development of national identity. You've had the younger generation has been born in Ukraine, and you see this younger generation fighting for Ukraine now. So I don't know, Putin is living in the dream world that he thinks that he can achieve this, because it's impossible to achieve, and therefore it's difficult for me to answer what's his end game, because his end game is impossible.
I have a very brief second question.
Right.
So Zelensky and the Ukrainians are saying, okay, you need to help us, because if you don't, then Russia will win, and after us there will be someone else. So do you think that Putin's plan is to invade Poland, Baltic states, or Kazakhstan, or it will just, okay, we will take whatever we want or we like to take from Ukraine, then we will stop there?
No, I think the most people now believe that excuse me, when you have a bully like Putin, or when you have a bully at school, if you don't stop them, they will continue to be a bully. And the problem with Putin is that he's been doing this kind of aggressive actions for the last 20 years. I mean, he killed a Russian exile in London in 2006, Alexander Litvinenko. So this is nothing new that he's been doing. But after the invasion of Georgia in 2008, there were no Western sanctions against Russia. In 2014, Western sanctions against Russia for Crimea were pathetic. They were nothing. And because the West has been so weak towards Putin until now, that's why he believed he would get away with the invasion. In the Kremlin, they miscalculated the Western response. They believed that the West would be weak and divided like in 2014. They were completely wrong. Just like they were wrong about Ukraine. But they were wrong because we sent them the wrong signals from the West. I mean, for example, they tried to do a chemical attack against to kill Sergei Skripal in England in 2018. And yet dirty money continued to come to London from Russia. There was no real change in Western policy. So I think now Western governments are realizing that the previous policy of kind of dialogue and appeasement and not really standing up to Russia was a failure. Germany is still confused. I mean, although Germany has changed in the last month, but it's still, I think, it doesn't feel comfortable in being tough in sending weapons. But now you have something like 30 countries, 30 including neutral countries like Switzerland, Luxembourg, Sweden, are sending weapons to Ukraine. This has never happened any time in history. 30 countries. So it's not just NATO countries. It's a far bigger number of people. Why are they doing it? I've already mentioned. Firstly, because they believe the previous policy of not standing up to Putin was a mistake. Secondly, they do believe that if you don't stop him in Ukraine, then the next potential target is the 3 Baltic states. 2 of those, Estonia and Latvia, have bigger Russian-speaking populations than Ukraine. And they are more divided. The Russian speakers in Ukraine are not so divided from Ukrainian speakers. In Estonia and Latvia, the divisions are greater. And they are small. They don't have Ukraine has a big army. And that's why it's able to fight. It's the 3rd largest army in Europe. So that's the second question. And and I think we also are afraid that what Putin thinks he's doing in Ukraine, in the minds of Moscow, in the minds of the Kremlin, they believe they are fighting the West already in Ukraine, because Russian views, Russian propaganda, Russian nationalism sees Ukraine as a U.S. puppet state. That Zelensky is a U.S. puppet, and that the war against Ukraine is a war against the United States. That's what they believe already. So for them, this is a war against the West already. I think in the West they don't want to believe this, but in Moscow they believe this. This is how they see it, and because Putin has the same view as China, that there's a need to change the unipolar world to a multipolar world, and the head of the unipolar world is the United States. And they see the United States as controlling NATO. So if Ukraine is defeated, NATO is defeated, the West is defeated, unipolar world is defeated. That's how they see it. So I think also many political scientists in the West view the war in Ukraine as a war, Putin's war against Western liberalism, against the Western system as well.
Nick, I think Nick has a question. Let me ask a technical thing. Taras, we would be happy to have you for as long as you want. So in order to calibrate also questions that are coming from the chat and the people in the audience, how much time further do you have available?
I'm okay. I mean, it's the evening, so it's fine.
Okay, wonderful. Then let's get going. So Odie, to the people in the chat, hold on a second. After Nick, I will collect some of the questions that are being asked on the various channels and convey them to Taras for answers. All right. Yep, I guess a glass of water is quite appropriate.
It's gin and tonic.
Gin and tonic. Well, I do the same thing at night. That's remarkable. You and I have got to go out for a beer as I come to London in late spring. Make sure. I call it the tonic water with antioxidant of Japanese making.
There you are.
There you are.
I don't have any digestivo, so I have to do gin and tonic.
Gin and tonic is much better. Go ahead, Nick. It's your turn.
Thanks very much. Dobry dzień, professor. U mnie jedna pytanie. I have a question. One of the things that interested me the most is why Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 when we already had a huge army. Our people were much more patriotic than in 2014. The government is now much more united than it was in 2014. And yet Russia has still invaded us. In 2014, Russia just stopped in Crimea and Donbass. Russia didn't even took all of the Donbass, just the eastern parts of the regions. And it didn't attack the whole of Ukraine. But in 2022, almost 8 years after the Crimea annexation and the Donbass war, Russia instead decided to finally invade. Why did Russia not invade Ukraine in 2014, and why did Russia invade Ukraine now?
It's a very good question. Firstly, you have to understand that nationalism is never rational. It's from the heart, not from the head. So that's one thing. You know, we shouldn't assume that what he's doing is rational from our point of view. Secondly, during those 8, in 2014 they tried to support uprisings in so-called New Russia, South and East Ukraine, but it failed. They never learned the lessons why it failed. Because nobody will tell a dictator like Putin, this is the reason why we screwed up. Dictators never get told this. They only surround themselves by sycophants, by people telling them how great they are. They don't get surrounded by people telling them the truth. So nobody, I'm sure, has told Putin, we screwed up. You know, those Russian speakers in Ukraine are all Ukrainian patriots. We shouldn't try this again. I think other factors are Putin has been isolated for about 2 or 3 years with the COVID, and he's become more paranoid. His mentality, KGB mentality, is already very conspiratorial, very paranoid. But you see with this big long table, he's even more paranoid. And that table is not just because of COVID. It's because he fears assassination. He fears, he's paranoid about the people around him. There are rumors he has cancer, thyroid cancer, which is you can survive from thyroid cancer. But another rumor is lung cancer, which you cannot usually survive from. So we don't know. We know that doctors have visited him, and his face looks different. He no longer rides horses with no shirts on. He's got a fatter face, and he doesn't look as healthier as he was, the big macho Putin. I think all of those factors, in those 8 years, I think I followed it. Territorial demands continued against Ukraine. For example, saying that the South and East Ukraine should never have been given by Lenin to Ukraine. They are Russian lands. They should be not part of Ukraine. This was repeated all the time. Also the influence of that kind of Tsarist nationalism continued to grow. You saw this on Russian television and Russian media. Ukraine was dehumanized. Ukrainians were dehumanized on a daily basis. These are idiotic peasants. They could never run an independent state. They are just Western puppets. They have no culture, no civilization. They need a big brother. This was repeated on a daily basis on Russian TV and Russian information warfare. So all of those factors. But you're right. Why now, when you have Ukraine in 2014 did not have a good army? Now it has. It has an army with 8 years of military experience, the best military experience in Europe because of the war. It's the third largest army in Europe, which is 250,000, together with National Guard, police, security service, territorial defense. This is 500,000. They have decent weapons, both Ukrainian and foreign. Training, Western training. So NATO standards training. This is very important as well, because the war in Ukraine is a bit similar to the war in Karabakh in Azerbaijan 3 years ago. Then you had Azerbaijani winning because they were trained by NATO in Turkey. They used Western weapons, Turkish drones. Armenians officers were trained in Russia. They used Soviet equipment or Russian equipment, and Armenia lost. And here's a similar comparison. You see this with how Ukrainians are operating as a military force, far more mobile in terms of moving around, and far more decentralized. The Russian military is completely hierarchy, and if you kill senior officers, they are confused. They don't know what to do. In a Western military, the middle officers are very important, the NCOs, non-commissioned officers, which Ukraine and NATO have. So yes, the army is now there. Ukrainians are more patriotic, including Russian speakers. And you're right, Zelensky won with a big majority in 2019. The only reason you can explain is what the things I've mentioned. Also, because Putin and the Kremlin were convinced that Ukrainians would not fight, that majority of Ukrainians are little Russians, and they would welcome Russian army's liberators. That's what they believed. That's why they believed they would capture Kyiv in 2 days. Well, there were two plans, in 4 hours or 2 days. And because of their mythology, their stereotypes about Ukrainians, they completely made a mess, completely miscalculated the invasion. And you saw this when, at the beginning of the invasion, they were calling on the Ukrainian army to rebel, to defect to the Russian army, which was like, really, which planet are you living on? This is not going to happen. Of course, the problem with Putin as well, like in 2014, is that the more there is military aggression, the more patriotic Ukrainians will become. This would happen in any country, right? And especially now, after when they found war crimes over the weekend, Ukrainian troops now will fight even more crazier, even more better against Russian troops than they did already. So Russian tactics, Russian cruelty, Russian war crimes, Russian very poor military strategy is going to work in Ukraine's favor, because what they have done is not make Ukrainians go, okay, we need to surrender. They've made Ukrainians more determined to fight. So yes, miscalculation before the invasion, miscalculation during, and of course their tactics have just, previous question was on pro-Russian movements in Ukraine. In 2014, because of what happened, pro-Russian movements in Ukraine, support for them collapsed from about 40%, 45%, and prior to 2014. So, like the party regions would get about this together with the Communist Party, 40, 45%. After 2014, this collapsed to 10%. After this invasion, it's 0%. There will be no pro-Russian support in Ukraine at all, especially, as I say, after these war crimes have been found. Every Russian speaker in Ukraine now will be Ukrainian nationalist. Everyone. They will hate Russia for decades. For decades. Because of what they have done in Mariupol, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, war crimes, raping of women from the age of 10. This is what has been found. Looting, just destruction for no reason of civilian targets. The hatred of Russia now will be, worse than what the French hated the Germans for decades. So Putin has miscalculated before the invasion, and he's completely miscalculated now. Putin will not go into Russian history as the unifier of the Russian world. He will go into history as the disunifier of the Russian world. This is the final divorce between Ukrainians and Russians. It's finished.
And another question. Before starting the invasion, before 2022, Russia stressed the importance of the so-called Minsk agreements, which then Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko signed. What I want to ask is why? What happened?
Okay, so I had a question on this topic that then it relates to my first question. I was asking. We discussed about how the the assimilationist sentiment developed in Russia, but my question was more on why some eastern regions in Ukraine developed this type of Russian sentiment that we had different live in here in this channel, where we understand actually how much was widespread this type of Russian sentiment in some eastern region. And I was thinking how culturally this sentiment developed, and if it was just wishful thinking of these people that they thought that the alliance with Russia will just be some soft power trade alliance which wouldn't need any type of military intervention, even before they saw what could happen if Putin starts to think that a region is more Russian than property of another nation.
Well, as I've mentioned, pro-Russian sentiment collapsed in 2014. It collapsed from about 45% in the previous elections. After 2014, pro-Russian sentiment collapsed because of military aggression against Ukraine and also annexation of Crimea. From 2014, Vladimir Putin was hated by 70-80% of Ukrainians, including other Russian leaders as well. So it already began to change in 2014, and today it's completely gone. There is no pro-Russian sentiment today in Ukraine. It's impossible. The reason why this pro-Russian sentiment was there in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Union was because it was a large Russian-speaking area in the east and south, 8 regions, and also because this was the most Sovietized region of Ukraine. Sovietization, the influence of communism is always going to be greater where there's industry and big cities and big towns, because then the workers can be controlled. It's less influential in small towns and in villages. And in this region of the south and east, there was a lot of these big industrial towns or historical ports like Odessa. So that was the reason why there was a pro-Russian sentiment, but it wasn't, pro-Russian sentiment, we have to be careful. It's not pro-Russian sentiment in the sense we want to be part of Russia. They want to be independent inside Ukraine, but have a good relationship with Russia. So positive relations. They were not anti-Russian, but they never said we were going to separate from Ukraine and join Russia. The separatism was only popular in Crimea, but even there it was never a majority. It was like 40%. And there was always Crimean Tatars who were pro-Ukrainian in Crimea. So there was pro-Russian separatism, but also Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians. It was not all Russian. The Russian population of Crimea was about 65%. And I never saw a single opinion poll which showed a majority for separation. But yes, there was separatism. So this pro-Russian or Russian-speaking sentiment was in favor of good relations with Russia, but also keeping an independent Ukraine. This all began to change in 2014, because when you have a war and you have bloodshed, when you have a conflict, you cannot sit on two chairs. You cannot sit on the fence. You have to decide, are you for Russia or are you for Ukraine? And if you were for Russia, then you supported Crimea, then separating, or in the Donbass, as you say, in a small part of the Donbass. Those separatist regions were about 40% of the Donbass. So even in the Donbass, it was not a majority. It was 60% controlled by Ukraine. But in the other regions, the 6 other regions of the south and east, those 6 other Russian-speaking regions, there was no support for Russia. And I have just finished editing a book about Dnipropetrovsk, which is the region west of Donbass. This was a very fascinating region because in the Soviet Union, it was the center of this military-industrial complex. This factory I told you about, which had the biggest factory in the world making nuclear weapons, was in Dnipropetrovsk. And they, in 2014, were very patriotic and supported Ukraine. And this is a city which has a big Jewish population. It's probably the biggest place of a Jewish revival in Europe in the last 30 years, in Dnipropetrovsk. And the city was led by Jews in 2014. But Jews do not like the Soviet Union. They hate the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union destroyed their culture and religion and forced them to emigrate. So you do not get Soviet nostalgia amongst Jews. And so they were all patriotically pro-Ukrainian in 2014. And yet they are Russian speakers. Most of these Jews are Russian speakers. So the reason why Putin, the question previously about why did Putin invade, in Moscow, they do not understand the concept of Russian-speaking Ukrainian patriotism. It is simply impossible for them to understand it. If in Moscow, they believe if you are a Russian speaker, you should be pro-Kremlin, pro-Putin. And they don't understand this is not going to happen. It's never going to happen. 95% or whatever.
Taras, let me get you on a controversial issue.
Right.
Let me get on a controversial issue. One of the strongest claims of the people that justify Russian invasion of Ukraine is that in the Donbass area, the Ukrainian army was committing sequences of crimes against humanity, killing civilians, bombarding these schools, and so on. And there are outlets admittedly, I've been trying to look at independent observers confirming that this was a one-sided thing. I've found evidence of violence against civilians on both sides of the contention. But there are obviously a large propaganda machinery coming from Russia describing a one-sided thing. What's your view, if you can try to be objective in that, both in action and counter-reaction, who started what, and the extent to which the Ukrainian army or the famous battalion that everybody keeps repeating about is responsible for a kind of widespread violence against Russian minorities in that area.
I'm actually quite fed up of these kind of questions.
I know,
but these are a product.
I understand, but you understand they keep coming up, and people need to be told.
Well, it's because your state TV is promoting Kremlin disinformation propaganda in Italy on these questions. Many Ukrainians complain about Italian state television fanning this. Ukraine has the lowest electoral support for the far right in Europe. And it's a joke when Italians, French, Germans complain about the far right in Ukraine. They should look at their own countries. The biggest levels of anti-Semitism in Europe are in France and Germany. This is a fact. I'm not making this up. The far right in Ukraine never wins votes in elections. Never. And if the far right was so popular in Ukraine, why did the majority of Ukrainians, 70%, vote for a Jewish guy? I somehow don't believe a Jewish person would get elected in France or Germany, to be quite honest. But he was elected in Ukraine, and he's now a Ukrainian hero for every Ukrainian. So I think we have to differentiate between how Moscow and Russian TV information warfare continues to promote a Soviet definition of Nazism, and which has nothing to do with what we as political scientists in the West understand. In the West, Nazism...
Well, it's coherent with the way, I was just sent a document from this foundation for the, let me read it because it's on the Ukrainian repressive state, from the Foundation for the Study of Democracy, which is run by some Russian congressman. And, it's signed, it makes a lot of very heavy statement. It proves very little, but it's exactly the propaganda that goes around. That's why, I'm asking for some way of debunking this. That's the work we do, right? You understand that in order to debunk...
The Russian position is the same as the Soviet position, which is that Nazism or nationalists, far right, are defined as anybody, and I mean anybody, who is not supporting Ukraine as part of the Russian world, part of the Russian sphere of influence. If you supported the Orange Revolution, if you supported the Euromaidan Revolution, you are a fascist in the eyes of Moscow. You are a Nazi. If you have Ukrainian national identity, you are a Nazi. If you support the Russian view that Ukrainians are little Russians, that they should be like Belarus, then you're not a Nazi. You're okay. So you need to differentiate between this very Soviet definition and what we in the West understand as the far right. The crimes against humanity that took place in the Donbass in 2014 are quite minuscule. Academic studies have found this quite minuscule compared to what you would normally find in those kind of conflicts, where there would be far more, shall we say, just extrajudicial executions.
Yeah, there's obviously a civil war in place, a civil war that the Russians have
No, it's not a
started.
civil war. This is again Kremlin disinformation. There's no civil war. This is Russian intervention. The term civil war is a term used in Moscow to disguise their involvement in this war.
Yeah, I understand that, and this is and I understand why you take this position, but to the extent that there is an external, we called civil war the Italian resistance, given that we are getting close to the celebration of April 25th, that now many pro-Putin people in Italy are using as an instrument of propaganda against Ukrainian. And people that are objective, and I have an old uncle and a father that were partisans, so I'm definitely involved, recognize it was a civil war. There was a minority of Italians decided with the external invader, the Nazi, the Germans, and there was another part that took arms together with the support of the Allied forces that did most of the job, one has to say, and fought against. Now, the Ukrainians don't have the Allied forces. They are forced to do alone. But one cannot eliminate the fact that there are. It doesn't matter if they are 1% or 5%.
I'm going to have to, and I'm going to have to. I'm fed up of your questions and you're doing. So I'm going to have to.
Don't get fed up. Don't get fed up. It's a friendly question.
I'm going to answer this, and I'm fed up of this Kremlin propaganda. Take a look at how Mariupol has been destroyed 90%. That is Nazism. That is Nazism.
Taras, yes. Taras,
So why are you bringing up 2014? Why are you not asking me about Mariupol today?
Taras, because it's 40 days that I stay up day and night supporting the Ukrainian, documenting Mariupol. Don't worry about people that are listening to you know that perfectly where I stand, with whom I stand, and what I fight.
So why are you asking me about 2014?
Because I want to fight the Putin support and the Russian lies in Italy. And I need your help.
You will not be successful in combating people who have views that will never change. I don't believe that these are people that we could have a rational debate with and they will change their views. I've given up a long time ago trying to debate with these pro-Russian people. They are believing everything they read from Sputnik or I don't know, whatever they watch, Russia Today, and they are not going to change. So why should we waste our time on them?
But even if they're not changing, then there are other people that just sees their views and nobody actually saying something about it, and then more and more people will join their ranks. This is what we need to stop. We need to stop the spread of disinformation.
As you understand,
I tell you what's the most important thing here. Italy is the second country in Europe in terms of the amount of oil and gas it imports from Russia. Germany's first and Italy's second. Italy and Germany are funding Russia's military machine, which is committing war crimes in Ukraine. That's what we should be talking about.
Exactly. But hold on. Hold your horses and think as a political scientist you are. If you're fighting the battle, and if you know that in order to fight the battle and win the war, you have to last long enough to break the Russian economy, given that there is a strategic choice that might be changed, and I hope it does change on part of NATO and the part of the United States, not to intervene directly. We know perfectly that if there was a way to get NATO to intervene directly just from the air, things will tilt around and this might be over soon, okay? But we know that that's a low probability. What we do know is that if we have to fight the Russian aggression toward Ukraine, which is an aggression toward Europe, and I agree with you, I deeply agree with you, we have to be able to avoid that the chain doesn't break. And the weakest points of the chain are, as you pointed out, more Italy than Germany, I have to say. Even if Germany is more exposed, Italy is a lot weaker from a political point of view. So if I look from the point of view of Italy, I want to fight that battle. My way of supporting the Ukraine is to make sure that the Italian public opinion, for bad and for how much, how can I say, feel ashamed of that, and I despise these people. I have to fight to make sure that I get the support of the majority of the Italian in favor of the Ukraine government. You understand that? That's the only way. I don't have an anti-tank weapons. I'm 66. In other times, I'm a pretty tough guy. I might even have gone, but right now it would be useless. So that's what I'm asking you to support. So understand that what I need is fuel for ammunition for when I get nonsense coming around to fight back. That's
just show them photographs of the war crimes. Show them the city of Mariupol. That should be enough. If they don't accept those photographs and videos of places like Mariupol and the women and men who have been murdered by Russian troops, then you will never convince them.
That's a possibility. That's a possibility. But let me give you a friendly suggestion to people like you that have the knowledge. This is going to be long, and the propaganda machine is strong, and there is a lot of ignorant people and people with strange predisposition here. So we do want to keep working on that.
I think that Putin's propaganda machine is now
introduce this guy. This is Professor Levine, just visiting from Italy.
Putin's propaganda machine is on the defensive now. It's not. I don't think it's very successful anymore.
I knew it had to be him. It's the only guy that can knock on my office door when I'm doing that with that authority and walking in without my permission. Anyhow, let me move on. I don't want to upset you. Trust me. We are definitely on the same side.
There was a question about Minsk agreement. I should answer as well.
Go on the Minsk, and then, if you can, go on your perspective. Many people have this, and I think it's more fear than concern. Have this view that this is a first step in the domino, and then there is the follow-up, Moldavia and the Baltic and so on. So go also on that part after the Minsk agreement.
Well, of course, the biggest danger is the Baltic states, because I've mentioned that in Estonia and Latvia there is large Russian-speaking populations. Estonia 30%, Latvia 40%, and what Putin would like to do is to show that NATO is not a serious organization. And the way he can do that, he thinks, is by testing NATO in the Baltic states, maybe. So that is the potential danger, yes. The thing is, we will never know. I mean, nobody expected, or very few people expected, Putin to invade Ukraine. So when people say now, oh, he won't invade the Baltic states, well, can we be sure? And I think it's difficult. But I think there's now, as I mentioned, a consensus in the West that Putin has to be stopped. That we were wrong for 15, 20 years to allow him to get away with so much, and we should have stopped him before. And now we have to stop him in Ukraine. So I think that is a majority viewpoint. And I don't think that Putin's propaganda machine is as powerful as it used to be, because it can't really be successful when you have all these images coming out. I mean, when I'm driving around, even for example Britain, there are Ukrainian flags everywhere in Britain. The level of public support for Ukraine in the West is the highest it's ever been. So I think it's pretty impossible for Putin to have major influence in terms of his propaganda machine. How is it possible for the Kremlin to successfully promote the idea it's okay to invade, it's okay to destroy cities, it's okay to create the biggest refugee crisis since World War II, and to kill civilians and commit war crimes? I think Putin's propaganda machine cannot be successful there. So I'm not so worried about it. And you know, when questions come up about Ukrainian Nazis or Ukrainian nationalists, I just find this so funny when it comes from Italy, Germany, and France, where you have the biggest far right movements in Europe.
No, you understand. You have no idea. You don't know me, man.
And but Salvini's now wearing a Ukrainian shirt.
You don't know me. You don't know how I treat Salvini. But don't worry about.
Salvini's pro-Ukrainian now, right? He's a populist.
Pro-Ukrainian the same way I'm pro-Jesus Christ. Forget about.
Of course, he's a populist. So he moves with the wind. I know.
Salvini is just a fucking liar. He's actually not even. He hasn't even come that close to even condemn Putin. One thing that you have to observe: he hasn't mentioned the last name of the Russian dictator once since the thing started. And his reaction yesterday to the re-election of Orban has been to come out right on top, right away, with a big picture of him shaking hands and congratulating his friend.
As we say in England, why would you bite the hand that feeds you?
Exactly. So but you have to understand, it's a big fight. You're talking to people that in Italy represent a minority position because we are neither fascist nor communist. It's from London, it's difficult to understand. I'm not crying, don't worry. It's just I work too much. It's difficult to understand. Italy is really the weak part of the chain. There's no doubt about it. That's why it makes it difficult. But anyhow, let's go on. So that's your view on the long run. Minsk probably you didn't address. Or did you?
The Minsk agreement was always a problem that the West and Ukraine had a different view to Russia as to the steps you take, which steps you take first.
Look, your average. If you can read the screen, this is your average Italian coward.
Mm-hmm.
Forget about the fact that he doesn't know how to write in English. It's
give up. Okay. Well,
you understand?
Yeah. Sure. The problem with Minsk was that Zelensky is a centrist, so he was ready when he was elected in 2019. He was very willing to do a compromise to reach a peace agreement. But a peace agreement for former KGB officers like Putin is a dirty word. He wants you to surrender, to capitulate, to put your hands up, like this last person recommends. And no Ukrainian president will do this. I mean, they will never put their hands up. Even though for Zelensky now it's extremely difficult because he's seeing all this destruction by Russia taking place. So the Minsk agreement did not get Russia what it wanted. And what Russia wanted was to use the Minsk agreement to bring Ukraine back to the Russian sphere of influence. And Ukraine said, sure, we'll have a peace agreement, but we decide where we go for foreign policy. We decide about our territorial integrity. The other main problem, I think, which prevented the Minsk agreement working was Crimea. Crimea's occupation has always been popular in Russia. In the last 8 years, it's been supported by 86% of Russians, including members of the opposition. Alexei Navalny supports the annexation of Crimea. So in Ukraine, it's the opposite. 80% of Ukrainians do not support it. So how do you do a compromise when 80% are angry about the occupation and 86% support the occupation? It's very difficult to do a compromise. And Russia has always said that the Minsk agreement does not apply to Crimea, only to Donbass. So for Russia, Crimea is a completed subject. There's no negotiation for Crimea. But Crimea is not recognized by any Western country as part of Russia. So,
but it's recognized by the Regione Veneto, led by a drunk buddy of Salvini.
So Russia got fed up with the Minsk agreement getting nowhere. So it moved to threats, sanctions, ultimatums in November, December, and then military invasion in February.
Sorry, can I intervene also to reply my professor Michele Boldrini regarding the so-called Ukrainian civil war. Well, it's not a civil war, and on the collaboration.
So Nick had a question, and I don't know why he cannot speak. If you want to write on the chat, I will read out loud, Nick.
No, I can hear him.
We can hear him.
I can hear him. It's okay.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I just wanted to do an intervention regarding the Russian propaganda, which always says that the Donbas war is a civil war. Well, actually, the first so-called Donetsk People's Republic ministers were all Russian citizens, like at example Alexander Borodai, and the first troops who occupied both Donetsk and then the Ukrainian city of Slavyansk were all Russians, which were led by Igor Strelkov. Also, these troops led by Igor Strelkov actually murdered Ukrainian civilians. In Slavyansk, they murdered some Pentecostals, and they even expelled the Gypsy population from Slavyansk. Not only, the majority of the troops, there are lots of reports about it, the vast majority of the troops of the so-called DPR and LPR were all or Russians or even irregular Russian formations known also as Don and Kuban Cossacks, which are just like thugs of Putin's army. This is the first thing that I wanted to say. And the second thing, and especially to reply to my Professor Boldrin, is that actually, like the German occupation of Italy, and at example the Japanese occupation of Chinese, during both of the occupations, there was, I don't believe that there was a civil war. First, in Italy, all of the military units of the so-called Italian social republics were completely controlled by Germans, and every Italian unit who refused to surrender to the Germans were just literally exterminated. We can just remember, at example, the Ecide di Corfu, the killings of Italian soldiers on the Greek island of Corfu. Furthermore, in history there are lots of cases of collaboration during the invasion of other countries. Just to finish, during the Sino-Japanese war, the Japanese, which did really lots of atrocities on the Chinese, recruited something like 600,000 Chinese to fight for the Japanese, but the majority of them didn't want to. They just threatened. Their families were threatened. They didn't have any other choice, and you can't call the Chinese who collaborated with Japanese like a part of an internal Chinese civil war. No, these Chinese were occupied by the Japanese, and they had, because of the Japanese atrocities, to fight for the Japanese. But it wasn't a civil war; it was a Japanese invasion of China.
And by the way, the pro-Russian, these proxy entities like the Donetsk Republic, People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic, attracted a lot of extreme left and extreme right people from throughout Europe, including from Italy. And more European
criminals from Italy. But given that we're talking about that
criminals,
region,
these were far-right fascists.
I'm quite aware. Given that we're talking about that region, let me ask, what do you think realistically, assuming things go in decent way on the terrain of war? Because now we're going to see the escalation there. We're probably going to see. But if you have an opinion about Odessa, please say. What you said before about the circle of Russia territory that the Russians trying to get correspond to what we actually kind of forecasted on the channel from when the invasion started more than a month ago, that was the territorial objective, plus killing the government and occupying Kyiv and destroying the industrial sector. So what do you think would be a reasonable or a likely outcome in terms of territorial control in that area. I find it very hard to figure out a way out.
Russia wants to prevent Ukraine having access to the Black Sea.
Right.
This would destroy the Ukrainian economy.
Right.
And so hence why the battle for this southeast area around Mariupol and west of Mariupol has become so important.
Yes.
And also in the Kremlin's eyes, if you resist our liberators, then you are Nazis, and therefore we will destroy you.
That would.
So I think the biggest battle will be for this southeast region. Yes. It seems to have failed around Kyiv, and one reason we haven't mentioned why it failed was because Lukashenko did not send his troops.
Right, that was a bit of a surprise. Do you have a political analysis?
I was not surprised. I never believed he would, because Lukashenko was always afraid those troops would defect to the Ukraine.
I see. So the view is that if I send them, I don't have the protection at home, and moreover, they're going to be.
Well, no, his regime is kept in power by not the army, but it's kept in power by the KGB, the secret police, still called KGB in Belarus, and by the riot police, these special forces in the police. Those are the ones that keep him in power, not the military. The military are conscripts, or 80% conscripts. So if he sent those to Ukraine, a country where there is no antagonism with Ukraine, he was afraid that, oh shit, they would just join and then they would go back to fight him. In Belarus, there was a partisan movement destroying train tracks, preventing Russia supplying troops in Ukraine. Russia was not able to completely use Belarus like it wanted to attack Kyiv. So I think that, yes, the big battle will be the southeast. I think they have missed the opportunity to even take Odessa, because if you attack from the sea, I'm not a military person, but when military people talk about this, and they say if you attack from the sea, the Russian losses will be huge. Yesterday, a Russian Black Sea vessel which was firing missiles at Odessa was destroyed by Ukrainian missiles.
Oh, so yesterday there was another one?
Ukraine destroyed a Russian ship which was firing missiles at Odessa. So if you send these, what they call amphibious landing craft with Marines to try to land on the beach of Odessa and to capture Odessa, this is going to kill thousands of Russian elite troops. Marines are elite. So I think they are a bit worried, and they hoped to kind of move to Odessa on land first, and that has failed. So they have not been very successful. But so I think the big battle will be, the southeast and the south, and we shall see what happens there. I mean, it's difficult to predict because you're right when you ask about the end game. Putin is a macho man. He cannot admit defeat. If he admits defeat, he's finished in Russia. And I'm sure I think we hear various rumors and other documents have been leaked that not everybody around him is very happy at what's happening, because it's not just that Russia is losing a lot of troops and a lot of equipment. That's one thing. But Russia's international image as a military power is now destroyed. The Chinese must be laughing at Russia as a serious military power today. Russia's actions, weak action in Ukraine, has convinced the Chinese that Russia is definitely the younger brother in the relationship. Because the Chinese also believe the Russians would be successful very quickly. And this is not good for China either, because everybody keeps asking China, where do you stand? Who do you support? And in the United Nations, China used to always support Russia on Crimea, for example, in United Nations votes, and now China abstains. So China's playing a game here. So Russia's image as a powerful military power, great power, has been completely damaged, and that is not good. If you're a nationalist, that's bad. It makes you embarrassed, and they will blame Putin for that, of course.
A question. Let's say that in like 1 month, 2 months, whatever, the Russian army collapses in the east and Ukraine wins the war. What do you think will happen in Russia? Like, they will just replace Putin with someone else, or the entire state will collapse? What will be the consequences for Russia?
There's a great English saying, which is, and I'm sure there's an Italian equivalent: there is no honor amongst thieves. This regime in Russia is a mafia state. They are nationalists, of course, but they are also mafioso. They're kleptocrats. So if something like this, what you're saying, happens, where, for example, large numbers of Russian soldiers are captured, like Stalingrad, something like this, and it becomes very embarrassing, or their losses become too high, and Russian soldiers do not want to fight. I mean, you have already many examples of Russian soldiers defecting or just leaving their equipment. The joke in Ukraine is that Ukraine today has more tanks than when the war started. Why? Because it's captured them from Russia. Russian soldiers just leave the tank and walk away. So if that kind of, shall we say, maybe not, collapse of everything, but slow collapse of different units begins to happen, then I think it would become very serious for Putin, yes, in Moscow, because then his image would be shown to be weak, and that would lead to maybe potential coup d'etat in Moscow, in the Kremlin. It would also encourage street opposition, of course, as well. Although I'm not a big optimist about a kind of a street revolution in Russia. It's extremely difficult to have the kind of revolution you had in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, Euromaidan. It's very difficult to have that in an authoritarian state. You saw that in Belarus 3 years ago, and you see this in Russia. It's very difficult when the state is a dictatorship to have a street revolution. But when the power at the center is weakened because of what you're saying, then that will lead to more people thinking, this is the opportunity to do it. This is now the opportunity to become more opposition.
And do you think that this reasoning, like that the government will become weaker and whatever, and so that there's a possibility for more opposition, could also, like, this reasoning made by ethnic minorities like Chechens, Dagestani, Tatars?
I don't think that it's the ethnic side is going to be a major problem, because these are quite small groups, and none of these Russian minorities really border Western countries. They all border the Caucasus, or they're in Siberia or somewhere. So they're not really. I don't think that so much is a threat to Russia. But Russia is a big country which could, if the center, it could go back to what it was like in the 1990s, a very disorganized and chaotic state. This is where the danger would be, I think. And the worry would be that somebody around Putin, and there's already talk about this, that he's concerned that this could happen, that somebody around Putin would say, this is disastrous. This path, what we're doing, is disastrous. We're losing too many equipment. We're losing too many soldiers. This is not good for our image. We need to stop. And I think when you start having these arguments in the top elite, we haven't talked about how this would be impacted as well by sanctions. sanctions experts say that the impact of sanction takes time, so not straight away, so 2, 3, 4 months. So in 2 or 3, 4, if you have a situation where the Russian army is not being successful, its casualty in 3 months, its casualty rate is 60,000, not 18. The economy is collapsing, finances are collapsing, then all of that could create problems for Putin. I think that until the invasion, I believed that Putin was going to be president for life, because he changed the constitution.
There are two other aspects here, given that we're going on the military. One is this, it's unclear if intentional or unintentional release of documents that says they want to get the religious celebration of May 9th to be, right? That kind of set a deadline for them.
Well, he has to
he has to deliver something.
Yes, he has to show or to pretend that there's some success. And there's only two possible ways, because I don't think it's going to be Odessa or Kyiv. So the two possible ways would be to capture all of Donbass. Prior to the invasion, Russia controlled 40%. So to capture all of Donbass, that could be potentially difficult, because Ukraine's best troops are in Donbass. Or secondly, sort of to annex this area of the southeast around Mariupol, right, and this area, right, along the Black Sea.
They need to close the connection there.
Yes. And I think that Ukrainians will increase their counterattacks there, particularly in Kherson.
So we know that there are elements that we can provide, even without direct intervention, to tilt the balance. What are your views of the British, maybe for internal electoral reason, but Johnson, not that I have a big appreciation of Johnson, but he's certainly a skillful politician. He sees the wind, he's trying to use it. Well, let's use it. À la guerre cum à la guerre. So he seems to be willing to provide support. Do you do you see there a way of getting more military support at high-level technological stuff that can actually tilt the balance from the US and from other European countries? Or will need more bucha, so to speak?
Well, they are already getting that. There was a report.
But it's a matter of time.
No, sure. The biggest, I don't think there's a major problem of equipment for Ukrainians to do the fighting. That they're getting, I think they're getting better equipment, and they receive good equipment. The biggest problem is, of course, the missiles fired into Ukraine from Belarus and Russia, which are fired at civilian buildings or at oil refineries, right, or infrastructure. This is destructive, and it's just, it has no, these are not military targets. So, and they kill civilians, they create more refugees. So that is where the West has not really helped so much in providing weapons that can bring down those missiles, because that is very sophisticated equipment. I mean, they are talking about bringing this, I think it's the SAM 300, I think it's called, from Slovakia, but that I haven't heard when that's going to happen. But those missiles are my biggest concern being fired. And Russia has fired 1,400 missiles into Ukraine. It's good that some of those, or I don't know what percentage, but maybe a decent sized percentage, have failed. They have not worked because of widespread corruption in the Russian army. This is, by the way, we haven't talked about this, but one of the factors why the Russian army is doing so badly is because of massive corruption. The Ukrainian soldiers are surprised at how badly Russian soldiers are treated. They have posted photographs of food rations given to soldiers which are 7 years out of date, and medical kits from 1978. Sometimes this big Russian equipment gets stuck in muddy fields because they've used cheap Chinese tires. So that corruption in Russia in general has, of course, also affected the Russian military, which has made it not so good as it should be, or as many Western experts believed it would. And that's another factor which is causing the Russian military to not operate very well.
Well, I have plenty of questions, especially from the chat, but I don't know if Nick, Bruno, and Dario want to add something. Otherwise, given that I'm following the chat and making notes, I tend to monopolize, and I don't want.
I wanted to make a question.
Are there any crazy questions in the chat, or are there any normal questions?
No. Some people are very concerned about nukes, but I already said I'm not going to talk about nuclear war because it's nonsense. You have no idea. The main question was about the follow-up, and you answer. There are questions, but they envisage the fact that if the West does not support the Ukrainian fight, if the West, in a way or another, how can I say, gives up or wavers, this may lead to a situation of desperation and an emergence of a Ukrainian form of terrorism. But that's a...
Well, you know, what's the difference between terrorism and partisan movements? They're the same. They do the same things in an occupation. So if Russia was able to be successful, they would be, of course, a partisan
There
movement.
would probably be internal resistance. I expect it to be.
Well, there's so many weapons now. I mean, you know, as I mentioned, there's about 500,000 Ukrainians with weapons, probably more. The territorial defense was supposed to be 100,000, is now over 200,000. So that's a lot of people with weapons. Even if you occupy, where are they going to go? They're going to obviously join some kind of partisan movement. But I don't think that Russia has the manpower, and you know, it's already
to even try to occupy the country. I think the only thing they can do is destroy.
Too big a country, too big an army to occupy the whole place. They just assumed that it would be easy because Ukrainians would be little Russians and say, bravo. It's a sign of how desperate Russia is if it is recruiting Syrian mercenaries and mercenaries from Georgia's occupied regions of South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and also from Nagorno-Karabakh. This is a sign of desperation by Russia.
I wanted to ask a question. There is a very interesting article which talks about how Russian propaganda began dehumanizing Ukrainians, even actually after the Euromaidan Revolution of 2004. Yet, after the Ukrainian election of 2010, there was actually a very pro-Russian and corrupt government in Kyiv, led by Viktor Yanukovych. Despite the fact that Russia, after 2004, started to dehumanize Ukrainians, and Russian TV started to talk about the annexation of Ukraine, the historical Russian lands, Malorossia, Novorossiya, and all this kind of shit. How did it happen that the Ukrainian elite actually let someone like Viktor Yanukovych get to the power in 2010?
In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych won a free election. And what could you do? He won a free election, not by a huge majority. It was, I think, it was 3%. He won by 3 or 4%. So it wasn't a huge majority. And he did have support, particularly in the Donbass region, where they didn't care if he was corrupt or the fact he'd been to prison twice. You know, most people in Western democracies would not vote for a president who has been to prison twice. But in this part of the country, they didn't mind, and he didn't win very big majority, and his attempt at kind of transforming Ukraine into an authoritarian country resembling Russia or Belarus failed because Ukrainians rebelled in 2013. but this was pressure from Putin all the time. Yanukovych was under pressure from Putin when he came back as president in 2012. Putin came back in 2012, and as I mentioned, he saw himself as this gatherer of Russian lands, somebody who's going to go into Russian history books as the bringing Ukraine and Belarus back. And so between 2012 and 2013, there was intense pressure on Yanukovych to drop negotiations with the European Union for this association agreement. And eventually, in November of 2013, Yanukovych agreed, which created the Euromaidan Revolution. And this is what makes Ukraine different from Russia and Belarus, because you had 500,000, sometimes 1 million people on the streets of Kyiv. In Russia, they can get 10, 15,000. Belarus was big in 2020 elections, but still not as big as those protests in Ukraine. So Yanukovych had to run away in February 2014. And that's when Putin was angry that his strategy of using Yanukovych to bring Ukraine back to Russia failed because of this popular uprising, this Euromaidan Revolution. And because of this, he invaded Crimea in February 2014. He said, I will now, я вам покажу, сука. I will now show you. And he did it, and the West didn't really do anything about it. The West reaction was very weak. The West only imposed sanctions after the shooting down of MH17 in July of that year. So Yanukovych was elected fairly. It was a free election, but he completely messed up, completely screwed up his presidency. He was under pressure from Putin to become a kind of a Lukashenko kind of president. And this is simply impossible. So that's why when you ask about the end game now, if the end game for Putin was impossible in 2013-14 of Ukraine becoming a Belarus, it's even more impossible today for Ukraine to become a Belarus. They don't understand that in Moscow, of course, and sadly, this will mean a lot more killing of people and soldiers and a lot more destruction. But because Ukraine will never become a Belarus, but sadly, I don't think they understand that in Moscow. They're convinced this is little Russia.
Do you think that Putin kind of assumes that his type of regime, like this populist autocracy, is somewhat superior to Western democracies?
Well, of course, but this is very deeply part of Russian nationalism since the 18th century. Russian nationalism has always had an inferiority complex vis-a-vis the West. And so leaders like Peter the Great, Stalin, were leaders who wanted to catch up, to bring Russia up to the West, to catch up with the West, as it were, with these radical reforms. And by this inferiority complex, the way they deal with it is by saying we are superior. And this is something which is attractive to Western populist nationalists like Salvini and like Le Pen. That we don't have multiculturalism, we don't have gay rights, we don't have, we support the nation state, sovereignty, no globalization, no integration into super big structures. And we defend conservative traditional values. This is Putin's arguments since 2012, and this is what attracts the Western far right, to what attracts Trump in some ways. But it's it's mythical as well, because Putin is using that at the same time as being a mafioso, at the same time as being a criminal. It's wrong to call it an autocracy. Russia was not an autocracy until until 2020. Then the constitution was changed to allow Putin to stay in power for basically forever until 2036. So most Western political scientists say that Russia became a dictatorship 3 years ago. And what changed as well was that Russia became a single man dictatorship. Until then, it was a collective leadership. And that's been a problem for Russia for this invasion, because Putin is no longer listening to a collective leadership. He's by himself. He's isolated because of coronavirus. And there's nobody around him telling him this is wrong, don't do this. So it's a dictatorship, and now what we're seeing is a movement into fascism in Russia. This Z sign, which was painted on Russian tanks coming into Ukraine, has now become like the swastika in Germany, in Russia. It's everywhere in Russia. Young people are painting it on their foreheads and elsewhere.
It's also on the T-shirts of young stupid Italians rallying against Green Pass and vaccine, if you care to know.
No, sure. I mean, it's that same kind of collective of people, and it's leading to support. There was a Russian opinion poll 3 or 4 days ago by the Levada Center. It's the last remaining independent sociological service in Russia. And they found that 81% of Russians support the war in Ukraine. 81%. So I'm also fed up of Westerners telling me that, oh, this is Putin's war. The Russian people don't support it. This is not true. The Russian people support this war. The Russian Orthodox Church supports this war. And young people support this war in Russia as well. They don't necessarily have all the information, sure, because they watch state-controlled TV, or they have, they believe in the myths which are given for the reason for invading. But this is a popular war in Russia. At the moment, this could change with increased casualties coming home, and also, secondly, the impact of sanctions and financial situation. All of this could change very quickly, this mood in Russia. At the moment, it's kind of this bellicose mood. And because Russian TV is saying we are winning, they're not saying they are losing. They're saying we are winning. But it's this Z sign and this cult of war is fascism. This is real fascism now. And we are moving to this. And the Russian media, when they talk about denazification, they are talking about killing Ukrainians who support a pro-Western orientation. And we saw that in the war crimes.
And I wanted to ask you just a brief question. What do you think of Vladislav Surkov, and what kind of influence did he had on Vladimir Putin's politics?
Well, he was very influential on his politics from the Orange Revolution up until 2 years ago, and he developed many of the important ideological positions of the Putin regime, such as sovereign democracy, as it was called, the Russian world, aspects of Russian soft power, attitudes to Ukraine, negative attitudes to Ukraine. So he was successful in developing what in Russia is called this political technology, which is sometimes translated as political consultants, but it's not the same thing. This is political technology, is political consultancies who only do dark things, who only do negative, attacks. They don't do positive. It's all dirty tricks. This is what political technologists do. And he was the king of this political technologies, of creating this kind of fake, fake opposition parties in Russia, which were like Zhirinovsky's party. This was a fake nationalist party, and other parties. So he was, of course, influential. I'm sure probably he is still doing stuff, but he's no longer the chief advisor. He was also very influential in the Donbass in creating this kind of official structures in the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, transforming this kind of disorganized separatists into an organized pro-Russian little state. So can we finish at 10 o'clock? Well, my 10 o'clock, your 11 o'clock.
As you feel, really. I mean, we are extremely grateful. I know perfectly 2 hours of this is taxing. So whenever you feel 10 o'clock, let's set a date at 10 o'clock.
Well, my 10 o'clock, your 11 o'clock, yeah.
Yeah. So quickly, should Georgia take advantage, like we have seen Nanga try to get some territory back? Chances of that?
Well, this is already happening to some degree throughout the region, that Russia's position is weakened generally. Russia's image as a strong military power has been very badly damaged, and all these Western experts on the Russian military were predicting, like in Moscow, that Ukraine would capitulate in 2 days. Now they all got it wrong, because they kind of believed in this mighty, powerful Russian army, not taking into account disorganization, corruption, lack of morale, and just no determination really to fight. And so yes, there is already examples of Russia's neighbors standing up to Russia. So at the United Nations, only one country from its neighbors supports Russia, Belarus. At the United Nations, Russia was supported by 4 countries: Syria, Belarus, North Korea, and one other country I cannot remember. That's it. No, India was neutral.
Eritrea.
India... Oh, Iran.
Eritrea.
Oh, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, Belarus. That was it. Yeah. So traditionally pro-Russian countries like Armenia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzia, these are traditionally pro-Russian countries who vote with Russia in the United Nations, did not vote with Russia. They are abstaining, like China. That's not a good sign for Russia, that the only country of its neighbors who is supporting Russia is Belarus. So even Kazakhstan, which needed Russian help to suppress a popular uprising, is not supporting Russia on this question. Yes, I mean, there is now increased conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh because Russia is withdrawing some peacekeepers from there. Russia had 2,000 peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh and is withdrawing some of those to use in Ukraine. So, of course, that means more conflict between Armenians and Azerbaijan. Moldova is also demanding things now, which it wasn't doing. Georgia is a funny. Georgia, it seems to be being very cautious, but you never know. I mean, things could change here as well in terms of its relationship to those separatist regions. But Russia has no allies in the world. I mean, Syria, Eritrea, North Korea, Belarus is not a great strategic victory for Russia.
Well, I'm stopping because I don't want to be interfering but too much with. Well, we have 2 minutes. Last statement by Taras, and then a round of applause.
Russia has Putin and the Kremlin miscalculated in 3 ways on this. We've kind of mentioned it already. It miscalculated the Western reaction, thought that the West would be weak, divided. Russia is like China. It believes the West is in decline, is in spiritual decline. It's the the dominance of the Western world is now coming to an end, and that the West will not really be strong enough and powerful enough to this. This is partly our own fault because we have in the past imposed weak sanctions, and also because we've taken a lot of dirty Russian money in the West. And that for people in Moscow, this means that, when you talk about human rights, you're not really being serious because you really like our dirty money. So they completely miscalculated on the Western response. And just to give an example of Germany, Germany completely has changed. Now Germany is going to be the third largest military spender in the world. Germany cancelled Nord Stream 2. Germany supported removing Russia from SWIFT. And Germany is sending weapons to Ukraine. They miscalculated with Ukraine completely because of their 19th century mythology that these are all little Russians waiting to be liberated. This was never true, but this is what they believed. And they never learned the lessons of 2014, their failure in the south and east of Ukraine. And thirdly, I think that they have miscalculated inside Russia because although today most Russians support the war, this is always usually the case in every country, that at the beginning of a war or a conflict, there's a growth in patriotism and a growth, and people rally around the flag, as they say. But I think this will slowly decline when you have the impact of economic financial sanctions come to bite, and when more and more information comes back about what the Russian army is doing in Ukraine, the crimes it's committing, and also the number of casualties. It's impossible for Putin's regime to completely prevent this information coming back, not only because of social media and other things, but also there's a huge army, something like 300, 400 computer experts in the world who are volunteering to help Anonymous hack Russia, this anonymous collective. And they have been extremely successful in hacking very important documents from Russian government organizations, government ministries, and also very successful in putting on Russian television true information about the war. This is just incredible how they've done this. And this, I think, is part of the general Western support for Ukraine. This is unprecedented, and people are just shocked. And they, with these war crimes now being publicized, the shock in the West is even greater. So I think that support will be even more. This, and my final point will be that this means that Russia is going to be defined as a terrorist state, as a country which is beyond international law, and its leaders and possibly the entire Russian army are going to be defined by the International Criminal Court as criminals, as war criminals. This is already happening now with the evidence that's been provided. And this is the second war after Syria where there is so much evidence available because of social media, because of journalists. There's no lack of evidence anymore. This is very different to, for example, Yugoslav war in the early 90s, where it was more difficult to get evidence. And just today, the Ukrainian military intelligence released details, very personal details of every Russian soldier who was based in Bucha, the place where the war crimes took place. So that's the amount of detail that's available for war crimes trials is huge. So I think this means that what Putin has done with the invasion was based on miscalculations. It's created a global crisis, global changes. Some of them are good, some of them are very bad, like increased oil prices and utility bills and everything else. But as I mentioned, until this invasion, I believed Putin was president for life. I no longer believe this now. I just don't see how he can survive all these potential crises that are coming to Russia. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Taras.
Дякую.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bravo.
And as we say in this occasion, but you say better than me, Nick, so you go ahead.
What? Nick,
Yes.
you're about to say something.
No, nothing.
Well, I'm about to say it then. Slava Ukraini, and good night.
Героям слава.
Okay.
All right.
We all thought, people like Michelle and me thought we were going to have maybe a quiet retirement, but Putin is not allowing this to happen.
It's okay. I had no plans for retiring, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
Let's say I would have engaged in other activity in the last 2 months.
Okay,
That's not
okay.
the case.
But anyway, Putin's going to keep us occupied for a long time.
Looks like this is going to get the last third of our life busy.
Yes.
Ciao,
Okay,
bello.
then. Thank you.
Good meeting you.
Good night.
Good night.